For 30 years, Mark Calaway did something almost no other performer in wrestling history managed to pull off. He kept the wall between himself and his character completely intact. No talk show confessions, no candid podcast breakdowns, nothing that let fans see where Mark Calaway ended and The Undertaker began. And then in 2020, that wall finally came down piece by piece in a documentary series that Calaway himself admitted people had been waiting 30 years to see. So today we're tracing the actual cracks in that kayfabe wall, the moments spread across 3 decades where the real man behind the Deadman character quietly leaked through, whether he meant for it to happen or not. Let's get into it. If you're into these deep dives into wrestling's most carefully guarded personas, that's exactly what this channel does. Go ahead and subscribe before we start. The first crack, oddly enough, sits right at the very beginning in a character origin story that took over a decade to actually get told publicly in any real detail. Before he was ever The Undertaker, Mark Calaway trained under the late Buzz Sawyer in the late 1980s and broke into the business in world-class championship wrestling as a masked competitor named Texas Red, managed by a man named Percival Pringle III, a name that means nothing to most fans until you realize Pringle would later become one of wrestling's most iconic characters himself, Paul Bearer. By 1989, Calaway had dropped both the mask and Pringle, moving to the United States Wrestling Association as the Master of Pain. From there, he bounced through WCW as Mean Mark Callis and even wrestled briefly in Japan under the name Punisher Dice Morgan. None of that early history was widely discussed for years because the entire point of the Undertaker character from the moment it debuted was to erase everything that came before it, presenting him as though he'd simply always existed exactly as fans first saw him. The actual creation of the Undertaker character finally got explained in real detail during a 2002 interview on the show Off the Record, years after the gimmick had already become iconic and long after most fans had stopped wondering about its origins at all. Calaway revealed that the character was genuinely the brainchild of Vince McMahon, who'd always loved the visual of an old Western-style Undertaker, the long black coat, the big hat, and built the entire persona in collaboration with Calaway himself, rather than simply handing him a finished concept. The story behind how he actually got the job is almost funny in hindsight, especially given how mythic the character eventually became after an initial meeting at McMahon's house that Calaway assumed was just a general conversation about opportunities. He got a phone call at home sometime later. "Is this The Undertaker?" the voice on the other end asked, with no further context. It took Calaway a second to realize it was Vince McMahon himself on the line, and once it clicked, he simply answered, "Hell yeah, I'm The Undertaker." That's genuinely how one of the most iconic characters in wrestling history got confirmed, over the phone, almost as an afterthought, with none of the ceremony you'd expect for a character that would go on to define an entire industry for the next 3 decades. Here's a question worth sitting with. If a company can invent an entire supernatural persona over a single phone call like that, how much of what made The Undertaker feel so genuinely real to audiences actually came down to Calaway's own personal commitment to protecting that illusion for 30 straight years afterward? That commitment shows up in one of the stranger, more human cracks in the whole thing, his real documented fear of cucumbers, which sounds almost too strange to be true until you realize how many people have independently confirmed it. The late Paul Bearer, his former manager and real-life friend for decades, confirmed the story publicly on the Jim Cornette Experience, tracing it all the way back to a childhood incident where Calaway's mother had pickled cucumbers in vinegar, made him eat some as a kid, and made him sick enough that he's reportedly avoided them entirely ever since that day. It's such a small, ordinary detail sitting next to everything else about this character, and that's exactly why it matters so much when you actually hear it. The Deadman, an unkillable supernatural force who no wrestler in the company seemed able to permanently defeat across 3 decades of storylines, was also just a guy with a genuinely irrational, deeply human grudge against a vegetable, thanks to something that happened to him as a small child, decades before he ever stepped into a wrestling ring. The family side of the character created its own uniquely strange real-world problem too, one that required Calaway to step fully outside the fiction just to reassure the people closest to him. When Kane debuted in 1997 as The Undertaker's supposed half-brother, the storyline built an entire mythology around a fictional childhood house fire, a fictional funeral home, and a fictional presumed death. Genuinely heavy, dark material for a wrestling angle, even by the standards of that era. Calaway later admitted on his own podcast, 6 Feet Under, that he actually had to sit his real parents down and explain the whole thing wasn't real because the storyline had gotten detailed and personal enough that they were legitimately confused by it. "Let me get this right, boy. Your mom," his father reportedly started, clearly working through the logic of a story that implicated their actual family, and Calaway had to reassure him it was all just storyline before joking that he was, of course, the better of the two half-brothers regardless. It's a small moment in the grand scheme of his career, but it shows exactly how far the character had blurred lines even within his own family, requiring an actual direct conversation just to draw the distinction between fiction and reality for the people who knew him best. Quick pause here. Drop a comment on which of these stories genuinely surprised you the most, because I think the cucumber story catches even longtime hardcore fans off guard nearly every single time it comes up. The most significant crack, though, came from someone else entirely rather than Calaway himself, Bruce Pritchard, on his Something to Wrestle podcast, revealing something Calaway had reportedly kept quiet about for years afterward without ever addressing it publicly. When The Undertaker returned to the ring at WrestleMania XX in 2004, dropping the leather-clad, motorcycle-riding, big evil persona he'd worn for several years in favor of returning to the classic supernatural Deadman character fans had originally fallen in love with, most fans simply assumed it was a beloved, obvious creative decision that everyone involved was excited about. According to Pritchard, Calaway actually hated the idea at the time behind the scenes, believing his big evil persona had given him far more versatility in the ring, more room to work different kinds of matches and styles than the more rigid, tightly controlled Deadman gimmick ever allowed him. He went along with the change anyway, and it ended up defining the entire rest of his career from that point forward. But the man behind the character had genuine private reservations at the time about the very persona most fans now consider his defining legacy, a detail that never would have made it out publicly if Pritchard hadn't shared it years later. And then there's the ending itself, which turned out to be far messier and far more human than the mythology surrounding this character ever suggested it would be. In 2017, at 52 years old, and only appearing a handful of times a year by that point in his career, The Undertaker lost to Roman Reigns at WrestleMania 33, then left his hat, coat, and gloves in the ring afterward, the universally understood symbol within wrestling of a performer's retirement from the business. By Calaway's own later account, he genuinely intended that moment to be the end of his in-ring career entirely. But the poor quality of that specific match reportedly bothered him enough afterward that he came back anyway, unable to let his career close out on something he felt hadn't represented him well. He ended up wrestling 8 more times over the following years, half of those appearances taking place at WWE's often criticized events in Saudi Arabia. His actual final match ended up being a purely cinematic, no-audience showdown against AJ Styles at WrestleMania 36 in 2020, performed during the COVID-19 pandemic with no fans in the building at all, and by most accounts, including many critics and longtime fans, it's regarded as by far the best of his final performances. A strange, quiet, almost private way for a 30-year career built on massive, roaring live audiences to actually conclude. That same year, the wall came all the way down for good. Undertaker, The Last Ride, a 5-episode documentary series, finally let Calaway speak openly about decades of material he'd never previously discussed on camera in any real detail. As he told ESPN ahead of its release, he understood fans had been waiting a long time for exactly this kind of honesty from him. "I think there's a lot of people that have wanted to see a lot of what they're going to get to see," he said. "They just had to wait 30 years for it. So here's what actually connects every single one of these moments together once you line them all up. A childhood fear of cucumbers, a private grudge about a beloved career decision most fans assumed he loved, an awkward conversation with his own parents about a fictional half-brother, an ending that didn't go the way the mythology suggested it should, None of it diminishes The Undertaker as a character in the slightest. If anything, it does the exact opposite. It shows just how much genuine discipline and personal sacrifice it took from one man to maintain an illusion that convincing, that consistent, for that long, only finally letting people see the person underneath once the character's story had fully run its course on his own terms. Which of these cracks in the kayfabe surprised you the most? Let me know down in the comments. And if you want more of these deep dives into the real people behind wrestling's most iconic characters, make sure you're subscribed to Wrestling Decoded. There's plenty more of this still to uncover.